The summer heat of 1814 hung over Washington City like a suffocating blanket. The young capital of the United States, barely 14 years old, stood vulnerable along the banks of the Potomac River. Its grand buildings, the President's House, the Capitol, symbolized American ambitions, but the city itself remained a construction site, with muddy streets connecting islands of civilization in a landscape still dominated by forests and swamps. Inside the President's house, James Madison paced the floors with growing anxiety. At 63 years old, the diminutive Virginian looked even smaller than his 5'4" frame suggested. His powdered hair, pulled back in an old-fashioned queue, and his black coat gave him the appearance of a Revolutionary War relic, which in many ways he was. Madison had helped forge the Constitution, served as Jefferson's Secretary of State, and now found himself presiding over a war that threatened to destroy everything the founders had built. The War of 1812, as it would come to be known, had dragged on for more than 2 years. What Madison and his war hawks in Congress had envisioned as a quick campaign to seize Canada and force Britain to respect American sovereignty had devolved into a brutal stalemate. The British Navy blockaded American ports, strangling commerce. American armies had suffered humiliating defeats. And now, with Napoleon's abdication in April 1814, Britain could redirect its full military might across the Atlantic. Madison knew what was coming. British veterans who had fought across Europe were boarding ships bound for America. The empire that had defeated the greatest military mind of the age was turning its attention to punishing its former colonies. The question was no longer whether America could win this war, but whether it could survive it. To understand the inferno that would consume Washington in August 1814, one must first understand how America stumbled into this conflict. The roots of the War of 1812 stretched back to the broader Napoleonic Wars that had engulfed Europe since 1803. Great Britain and Napoleonic France were locked in a death struggle for continental supremacy. Both empires sought to strangle each other's trade, and the United States, as a neutral shipping nation, found itself caught in the crossfire. The British Royal Navy, asserting its dominance of the seas, began stopping American merchant vessels, searching them for contraband, and impressing sailors, forcibly conscripting men they claimed were British subjects into Royal Navy service. The practice of impressment infuriated Americans. The Royal Navy seized thousands of sailors from American ships, often taking men who were natural-born American citizens. The British argued they needed these men to maintain their fleet, which stood as the only barrier between Napoleon's armies and the invasion of Britain itself. To Americans, it was an intolerable violation of sovereignty. President Thomas Jefferson had tried economic warfare, imposing an embargo on foreign trade in 1807. The policy proved disastrous, devastating the American economy while barely affecting Britain. When Madison succeeded Jefferson in 1809, he inherited this tangled mess of failed diplomacy and wounded national pride. By 1812, a new generation of congressmen had arrived in Washington, men too young to remember the Revolutionary War, but eager to prove themselves worthy of their father's legacy. These war hawks, led by Henry Clay of Kentucky and John C. Calhoun of South Carolina, demanded action. They spoke eloquently of national honor, of territorial expansion, of seizing Canada from Britain and Florida from Spain. Madison, the bookish constitutional scholar, found himself swept along by this martial enthusiasm. He was also a pragmatic politician facing re-election. On June 18, 1812, he signed a declaration of war against Great Britain, the first time the United States had formally declared war on another nation. The declaration passed Congress by the narrowest of margins. The House voted 79 to 49 in favor, the Senate 19 to 13. Federalist opponents, concentrated in New England where shipping interests dominated, denounced it as Mr. Madison's War. They warned that America was unprepared, that the Army was undermanned and poorly trained, that the Navy was vastly outnumbered, and that the government lacked the financial resources to wage a sustained conflict. They were right on every count. The war hawks had sold Congress and the public on a seductive fantasy. Canada would fall quickly, perhaps even welcome American liberation from British rule. Former President Jefferson confidently predicted that seizing Canada would be a mere matter of marching. Reality proved far different. The first American invasion of Canada, launched in July 1812 across the Detroit River, ended in catastrophic failure. General William Hull, terrified by reports of hostile Indians and British regulars, surrendered Detroit without firing a shot. 2,000 American soldiers became prisoners of war. The British commander, General Isaac Brock, had barely 1,000 men under his command, but understood that boldness could compensate for numbers. Brock's audacity extended further. In October 1812, American forces attempted to invade across the Niagara River. At the Battle of Queenston Heights, Brock led a desperate counterattack that threw the Americans back. The British general died in the assault, becoming a Canadian martyr, but his victory exposed American military incompetence. American militia refused to cross into Canada, claiming their enlistment terms required them only to defend American soil. The pattern repeated throughout 1812 and 1813. American forces would mass at the border, cross with high hopes, and then retreat in disorder after British regulars and Canadian militia, often allied with Native American warriors, outfought and outmaneuvered them. The Naval War told a different story. The United States Navy, though tiny compared to the Royal Navy's 600 warships, boasted some of the finest frigates afloat. In the war's opening months, American captains won a series of stunning single-ship victories. The USS Constitution defeated HMS Guerriere in August 1812, earning the nickname Old Ironsides when British cannonballs seemed to bounce off her sturdy oak hull. These victories electrified the American public and shocked the British, who had grown accustomed to naval supremacy. But individual ship victories could not change strategic realities. By 1813, the Royal Navy had established a tight blockade of American ports. Commerce withered, government revenues plummeted. Madison's administration struggled to borrow money or collect taxes. The war that was supposed to assert American independence was instead revealing American vulnerability. In the war's Western theater, the conflict took on an especially brutal character. Native American tribes, led by the Shawnee chief Tecumseh, allied with Britain in hopes of halting American expansion into their lands. Tecumseh envisioned a great native confederacy that could stand as an independent force between American and British territories. His warriors fought with desperate courage, knowing they were battling for their people's survival. The death of Tecumseh at the Battle of the Thames in October 1813 shattered native resistance in the Northwest. American forces under William Henry Harrison defeated a combined British and native force, killing Tecumseh in the fighting. With him died the last real hope of Native American independence east of the Mississippi. By early 1814, the war had reached a bloody stalemate. American forces had finally achieved some success in the North, defeating British attacks and burning the Canadian capital of York, modern Toronto. But these victories came at enormous cost, and the war's strategic picture remained unchanged. Then came news that transformed everything. Napoleon had abdicated. The Duke of Wellington had broken Napoleon's armies in Spain, and Allied forces had marched into Paris in April 1814. The wars that had consumed Europe for 2 decades were finally over. Britain, exhausted but victorious, could now give its full attention to the American conflict. British public opinion demanded punishment for American presumption. American forces had burned York and attacked Canadian settlements. The British wanted revenge, and they had the means to deliver it. Thousands of battle-hardened veterans, men who had fought from Portugal to France, began boarding transport ships bound for America. The British strategy for 1814 was threefold: invade northern New York and march down the Hudson Valley toward New York City, raid the Chesapeake Bay region and threaten Washington and Baltimore, and seize New Orleans to control the Mississippi River and the Western Territories. If successful, these operations would dismember the United States, possibly forcing the secession of New England, where anti-war sentiment ran high, and paralyzing the young nation. Madison received intelligence of British preparations with mounting alarm. His cabinet was divided and ineffective. Secretary of War John Armstrong, a former Revolutionary War general, possessed ability but inspired little confidence. Armstrong believed the British would never attack Washington directly. The city had little military value, and striking at it would require the British fleet to sail up the Patuxent River, leaving their ships vulnerable. Madison himself tried to balance these competing views while managing a war effort that seemed to lurch from crisis to crisis. His wife, Dolley Madison, became his greatest asset, At 46, Dolley was everything James was not: tall, vivacious, socially commanding. She presided over Wednesday evening drawing rooms at the president's house that brought together politicians, diplomats, and military officers. In an age when political wives were expected to remain invisible, Dolley Madison was a political force, smoothing over disputes and gathering intelligence through social channels. The President and First Lady made an unlikely team, but they were devoted to each other and to the republic they served. As summer approached, both sensed that a crisis was approaching. In June 1814, a British fleet under Admiral Sir Alexander Cochrane arrived in Chesapeake Bay. Cochrane was a veteran commander with a reputation for ruthlessness. He brought with him troop transports carrying thousands of soldiers under the command of Major General Robert Ross, another Peninsula War veteran known for his tactical skill and personal bravery. The British began raiding plantations along the coast, liberating enslaved people who fled to their ships. Cochrane issued a proclamation offering freedom to any slaves who reached British lines, knowing this would both weaken the American economy and bolster his own forces. Hundreds of black Americans escaped to the British, forming the Colonial Marines, units that fought with particular determination against their former enslavers. Throughout July, the British fleet probed American defenses. They raided small towns, destroyed tobacco warehouses, and gathered intelligence. Ross was searching for an opportunity, a weak point in American defenses that would allow him to strike a dramatic blow. He found it in the Patuxent River. On August 19, 1814, British sailors and Marines began rowing up the Patuxent River in a fleet of barges. Admiral Cochrane's heavy warships remained in Chesapeake Bay, but the shallow draft vessels could navigate the river system. By evening, the British had landed at Benedict, Maryland, about 40 miles southeast of Washington. Major General Ross assembled his invasion force, approximately 4,500 soldiers, including elements of the 4th, 44th, and 85th Regiments of Foot, along with detachments of Royal Marines and Colonial Marines. These were professional soldiers, most of whom had fought in the peninsula. They were veterans of Talavera, Salamanca, and Vittoria, battles where they had faced and defeated the finest troops Napoleon could field. The Americans had nothing to match them. The regular army was scattered across the frontier. Washington's defense fell to militia units, part-time soldiers with minimal training and no combat experience. Secretary of War Armstrong had stationed about 1,000 regular troops in the capital, along with some artillery and cavalry, but he still believed the British were bluffing, that their real target lay elsewhere. As the British began their march from Benedict on August 20th, panic spread through Maryland. Couriers raced to Washington with news of the invasion. Madison finally ordered a general mobilization of militia, but the response was chaotic. Militia units assembled without proper equipment, ammunition, or leadership. Many men had no muskets. Some had never fired a weapon. Command of the defensive forces fell to Brigadier General William Winder, a Baltimore lawyer with minimal military experience who had been captured during a botched raid into Canada. Winder was brave but overwhelmed, racing around the countryside trying to organize a defense while Ross's professionals marched steadily northward. The British advance was deliberate and disciplined. Ross moved his force about 12 miles per day, giving his men time to rest in the oppressive August heat. The soldiers suffered in their heavy wool uniforms, and several died of heat stroke, but the army maintained its cohesion. Officers enforced strict discipline, prohibiting looting or violence against civilians. Ross wanted to demonstrate that British forces operated according to the rules of civilized warfare, at least until they reached their objective. On August 22nd, Madison himself rode out from Washington to observe the defensive preparations. The sight must have been disheartening. Militia units milled about in confusion. Officers argued over positions and responsibilities. Winder seemed incapable of issuing coherent orders. Monroe, who had accompanied Madison, tried to take charge, positioning troops along the roads leading to Washington, but he lacked military expertise and authority. That evening, Madison returned to the president's house. He found Dolley overseeing preparations for evacuation. She had ordered the household staff to pack important documents, including the Declaration of Independence and George Washington's correspondence. She also insisted on saving the full-length portrait of George Washington that hung in the state dining room. a painting by Gilbert Stuart that had become an iconic image of the first president. The president urged her to be ready to leave at a moment's notice, then returned to his own preparations. He wrote letters to his cabinet, reviewed reports from Winder's camp, and tried to project confidence he did not feel. Outside, the city began to empty. Civilians loaded wagons with belongings and fled north or west. Rumors spread that the British would burn everything, that they had orders to show no mercy, that Washington would be destroyed. On August 23rd, Ross's army reached Upper Marlborough, just 16 miles from Washington. The British paused to gather intelligence and assess American defensive positions. Ross learned that the Americans were concentrating their forces at Bladensburg, a small town on the eastern branch of the Potomac River where the main road to Washington crossed a bridge. The British general decided on a bold move. He would march directly on Bladensburg, smash through whatever forces defended it, and advance on Washington before the Americans could organize an effective defense. August 24, 1814 dawned hot and humid. British soldiers began marching before dawn, eager to bring the campaign to a climax. They followed the main road toward Bladensburg, drums beating, colors flying. For many of these veterans, this felt like an easy campaign compared to the desperate battles in Spain. The American militia they had encountered so far had run at the first sight of British bayonets. At Bladensburg, General Winder had assembled about 6,000 American troops to defend the bridge over the eastern branch. The militia units stood in 3 defensive lines, with artillery positioned to cover the bridge. On paper, the Americans had a significant numerical advantage and held a strong defensive position. If they could hold the bridge and use their artillery effectively, they might stop the British advance. But these militiamen had never faced professional soldiers in battle. As they stood in the August heat, waiting for the British to appear, fear spread through the ranks. Officers tried to maintain order, but many of these citizen soldiers were already contemplating retreat. Madison and his party had watched the battle unfold with horror. As the American lines collapsed, Monroe urged the president to leave immediately. British cavalry was pursuing the fleeing militia, and if Madison were captured, it would be a catastrophe. The president reluctantly turned his horse and rode west, abandoning any hope of rallying the army. Winder tried desperately to organize a defense of Washington itself, but the fleeing militia could not be stopped or reformed. Men threw away their weapons and equipment as they ran. Some didn't stop until they reached Baltimore, 35 miles away. The road to Washington lay open, defended only by the ghosts of American pretensions. British soldiers marched into Washington around 8 p.m. on August 24th. The city lay nearly deserted. Most civilians had fled. The government had evacuated. Even the militia was scattered across the countryside. Ross rode at the head of his column, accompanied by Admiral Cockburn, who had come ashore to participate in the capture of the American capital. The British advance was cautious at first. Ross expected traps, snipers, perhaps a last-ditch defense. Instead, they found an empty city. The only resistance came from a single house on Maryland Avenue, where someone fired at the British column. The shots killed Ross's horse and wounded several soldiers. The British immediately torched the house and executed its occupants, a harsh reminder that British discipline did not extend to those who violated the rules of war. Ross and Cockburn's primary objectives were government buildings. They were not interested in burning the entire city or terrorizing civilians. That would be seen as barbaric in the eyes of European powers Britain sought to impress. Instead, they would destroy the public buildings that symbolized American government and military power: the Capitol, the President's House, the Treasury, the War Department, and the Navy Yard. The British arrived at the Capitol first. The building, still unfinished, consisted of 2 wings connected by a temporary wooden walkway. Soldiers and sailors surged inside, marveling at the grandeur of the chambers. Some took souvenirs, books, documents, furniture. Others simply destroyed what they found, smashing statues and paintings in an orgy of vandalism. Admiral Cockburn, known for his arrogance and love of theatrical gestures, reportedly sat in the Speaker's chair in the House of Representatives and called for a mock vote. "Shall this harbor of Yankee democracy be burned? All for it say aye." His men roared their approval. Sailors then piled furniture, books, and documents into great heaps, poured gunpowder over them, and set them ablaze. The Capitol burned spectacularly. The fires, fed by the building's wooden interior and the books of the Library of Congress, could be seen for miles. Flames shot through the windows and up through the dome. The heat was so intense that the sandstone exterior cracked and blackened. 2 centuries of work and American aspirations went up in smoke. From the Capitol, the British marched to the President's house. They found it abandoned but not empty. Dolley Madison had fled only hours before, but she had left behind a dinner table set for 40 guests, complete with wine, food, and silver. The British officers sat down and enjoyed the meal, toasting their victory with Madison's wine. Admiral Cockburn took particular pleasure in ransacking the president's personal belongings. He pocketed souvenirs, including a cushion from Dolley's chair and one of Madison's hats. Some officers took books from the library. Others simply wandered through the rooms, astonished at the luxury of the residence. When they had finished eating and looting, the British set fire to the president's house. Soldiers piled furniture in the center of each room and ignited it. The fires spread quickly through the mansion's wooden interior. By midnight, the building was an inferno, its sandstone exterior glowing in the flames like a furnace. The British moved systematically through the city. The Treasury building burned. The War Department went up in flames. At the Navy Yard, American forces had already set fire to ships and facilities to prevent them from falling into British hands. But Cockburn's men completed the destruction, burning everything that remained. Throughout the night, Washington blazed. Residents who had remained in the city watched from hiding as British soldiers moved through the streets like ghosts in the firelight. Some witnesses later reported that the British were generally disciplined, not looting private homes or attacking civilians. Others claimed that colonial Marines and sailors engaged in theft and violence. The truth likely fell somewhere between, with most British forces following orders while some individuals took advantage of the chaos. Around midnight, a violent thunderstorm swept over Washington. Rain fell in torrents, helping to extinguish some of the fires and preventing the flames from spreading to private homes. Some witnesses interpreted the storm as divine intervention, God's judgment on the British sacrilege. More prosaic observers simply appreciated that the rain prevented the entire city from burning. President Madison, meanwhile, had fled into Virginia. He spent the night at a tavern in Great Falls, about 15 miles from Washington, surrounded by a small group of advisors and guards. Reports reached him throughout the night of the destruction of his capital. The president, exhausted and despondent, could only wait for dawn and hope that the Republic would survive this humiliation. Dolley Madison's flight from Washington had become its own legend. She had remained at the president's house until the last possible moment, supervising the evacuation of documents and valuables. Her most famous act was saving Gilbert Stuart's portrait of George Washington. When the frame proved too difficult to remove quickly, she ordered the canvas cut from its mounting. The portrait, along with crucial government papers, was loaded into a wagon and spirited away just hours before the British arrived. Dolley crossed the Potomac into Virginia and took refuge at a friend's estate. She spent an anxious night, watching the glow of fires on the horizon and wondering if she would ever see her husband again. In the coming days, her courage and composure during the evacuation would make her a heroine to Americans humiliated by their army's defeat. On the morning of August 25th, British troops surveyed their handiwork. The Capitol was a burned-out shell, its exterior walls standing but everything inside destroyed. The president's house was a blackened ruin. The Treasury and War Department buildings were gone. The Navy Yard smoldered. Central Washington looked like it had been struck by a natural disaster. General Ross faced a decision. Should he remain in Washington, occupy the city, and dare the Americans to retake it? Or should he withdraw before American forces could reorganize and cut off his line of retreat? The British had achieved a tremendous propaganda victory, but they were deep in hostile territory with a limited force. If Winder managed to gather even a portion of the scattered militia and block the British retreat, Ross's army could be trapped. The afternoon brought more violent thunderstorms, so intense that witnesses reported a tornado touching down in the city, destroying buildings and killing several British soldiers. This, combined with intelligence reports of American forces gathering to the north, convinced Ross to withdraw. On the evening of August 25th, barely 24 hours after entering Washington, the British Army began its march back toward Benedict and their waiting ships. The withdrawal was orderly and deliberate. British rearguards remained in the city until midnight, destroying any military supplies they found. Some soldiers set fire to additional government buildings. By dawn on August 26th, Washington was once again in American hands, or what remained of it. Madison returned to the city on August 27th. What he found shocked him, even though he had been warned. The president's house stood as a gutted shell, its sandstone walls blackened by smoke. The Capitol was destroyed. His government had been humiliated, and the physical symbols of American sovereignty had been reduced to ruins. But the president also found something unexpected: resolve. The burning of Washington galvanized American public opinion in ways that 2 years of inconclusive warfare had not. Federalist newspapers that had condemned Mr. Madison's war now called for vengeance. State governments that had been reluctant to provide militia suddenly competed to send men to defend Baltimore, which intelligence suggested was the British next target. The disaster at Washington had paradoxically strengthened American resistance. The British had proven they could strike at the heart of American government, but they could not hold territory, and their brutal destruction of national symbols created martyrs and rallying cries. Madison understood immediately that how he responded to this crisis would define both his presidency and possibly the nation's future. His first priority was reconstituting the government. Madison accepted Secretary of War Armstrong's resignation. The man had been proven disastrously wrong about Washington's vulnerability and had lost all credibility. Madison appointed Monroe as interim Secretary of War, while Monroe continued serving as Secretary of State, giving his most trusted advisor control of military affairs. The second priority was defending Baltimore. The British fleet was already sailing up Chesapeake Bay toward that city, Maryland's largest and most important port. Baltimore had a substantial population, commercial infrastructure, and critically, a well-organized militia. If the British could take Baltimore, they would control Chesapeake Bay and could potentially hold it as a bargaining chip in peace negotiations. Madison dispatched Monroe to Baltimore with orders to coordinate the city's defense. Unlike Washington, Baltimore would not be caught unprepared. Baltimore in September 1814 was a city transformed by war. Home to aggressive privateers who had captured hundreds of British merchant ships, Baltimore had earned British hatred. Admiral Cochrane reportedly wanted to see the city laid in ashes. The city's residents knew that if the British came, they would face a determined assault. Under the leadership of Major General Samuel Smith, a Revolutionary War veteran and U.S. Senator, Baltimore had been preparing for attack since news of Washington's fall reached the city. Smith, unlike Winder, was an effective organizer and leader. He assembled a force of approximately 15,000 militia and regular troops, far larger than the 6,000 that had defended Bladensburg. More importantly, he positioned them in strong defensive works ringing the city. The key to Baltimore's defense was Fort McHenry, a star-shaped fortification guarding the harbor entrance. The fort's cannons could interdict any British ships trying to reach the city's docks. Major George Armistead commanded Fort McHenry with a garrison of about 1,000 soldiers. Armistead had commissioned an enormous American flag, 30 feet by 42 feet, to fly over the fort, ensuring that friend and foe alike could see that the fort remained in American hands. The British approached Baltimore with a two-pronged strategy. General Ross would land his army at North Point, about 14 miles southeast of the city, and march overland to attack Baltimore's eastern defenses. Meanwhile, the Royal Navy would sail up the Patapsco River and bombard Fort McHenry into submission, allowing ships to pass and attack the city from the harbor. On September 12th, Ross landed his army at North Point. About 3,200 American militia under Brigadier General John Stricker marched out to meet them. The two forces collided at a narrow point between two creeks, with thick woods on either side limiting maneuver. The Battle of North Point was a confused, close-range fight. American militia, hidden in woods and behind fences, poured fire into the advancing British. Ross, riding at the front of his column to inspire his men, was struck by a musket ball and fell from his horse, mortally wounded. The death of their commander shocked the British, but Colonel Arthur Brooke, second in command, quickly took charge and drove the Americans back. Stricker's militia conducted a fighting retreat, falling back toward Baltimore's fortifications in good order. This was nothing like the rout at Bladensburg. The American militia had stood their ground, inflicted casualties on the British, and killed the enemy commander. When they reached Baltimore's defenses, they took positions alongside the other defenders and prepared for the British assault. Brooks' army advanced cautiously on September 13th. What he found dismayed him. Baltimore's eastern approaches were protected by extensive earthworks manned by thousands of militia. Artillery positions covered all the approach roads. Any assault would be costly, and without Ross's leadership, Brooke was reluctant to order a frontal attack. The British plan depended on the Royal Navy forcing the harbor. If the fleet could silence Fort McHenry and reach Baltimore's docks, Brooke could coordinate a combined land-sea assault. If not, attacking the fortifications with infantry alone would be suicidal. On the morning of September 13, 1814, a British fleet of 16 ships, including bomb vessels and rocket ships, anchored about 2 miles from Fort McHenry and opened fire. The bombardment would last 25 hours, one of the longest naval bombardments in history to that point. The bomb vessels lobbed explosive shells high into the air, the projectiles arcing through the sky before crashing down near or inside the fort. Rocket ships fired Congreve rockets, primitive but terrifying weapons that shrieked through the air, trailing flame and smoke. The psychological effect was tremendous, but the physical damage was limited. The British were firing at maximum range, beyond the reach of Fort McHenry's cannons, but also at the limit of their own weapons' accuracy. Inside the fort, Major Armistead ordered his men to take cover and endure. There was little else they could do. American cannons fired back when British ships ventured too close, forcing them to retreat. But most of the time, the garrison could only wait as shells exploded around them and rockets streaked overhead. The bombardment continued through the day and into the night. British ships fired approximately 1,500 shells and rockets at Fort McHenry. Explosions lit up the night sky. The noise was deafening. Several shells crashed through buildings inside the fort, killing or wounding soldiers, but the thick earthen walls absorbed most of the punishment. Watching from a British ship anchored with the fleet was Francis Scott Key, a Washington lawyer and amateur poet who had come to negotiate the release of an American prisoner. The British had agreed to free the prisoner but detained Key and his party during the attack on Baltimore, not wanting them to warn the city. Key spent the night of September 13-14 on the deck of a ship, watching the bombardment and wondering if Fort McHenry would survive. Around 1 a.m. on September 14th, the British bombardment intensified. Admiral Cochrane ordered a boat attack. Barges filled with Royal Marines would row close to the fort under cover of darkness, land troops, and attempt to storm the walls. If Fort McHenry fell, the fleet could enter the harbor and Baltimore would be doomed. The boat attack was a disaster. American sentries spotted the barges approaching and opened fire. Fort McHenry's cannons, loaded with grape shot, swept the water with deadly effect. Other American batteries joined in, creating a crossfire that decimated the British boats. The Marines suffered heavy casualties and retreated in disorder. The assault had failed. By dawn on September 14th, the British bombardment was slackening. Admiral Cochrane realized that Fort McHenry could not be reduced by naval gunfire alone, and without controlling the harbor, the fleet could not support Brooks' army. At the same time, Brooke sent word that Baltimore's land defenses were too strong to assault without naval support. The British had reached a strategic dead end. They could not take Baltimore without suffering catastrophic casualties, and the city's capture, even if achieved, would not change the war's overall trajectory. Cochrane and Brooke agreed to withdraw. As dawn broke on September 14th, Francis Scott Key strained to see through the smoke and mist hanging over the harbor. Had Fort McHenry fallen during the night? Were British forces now occupying the fortification? Then the smoke cleared, and Key saw it. The enormous American flag, tattered by shell fire but still flying over Fort McHenry. Overwhelmed by emotion, Key pulled an envelope from his pocket and began writing a poem. "Oh, say, can you see, by the dawn's early light, what so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming?" The poem, set to the tune of a popular British drinking song, would eventually become the Star-Spangled Banner, America's national anthem. But in that moment, It was simply the relief and pride of a man who had watched his country's flag survive through the night. The failure at Baltimore marked a turning point in the War of 1812. British forces withdrew from Chesapeake Bay and sailed south, planning to strike at other targets. But the psychological damage was done. The empire that had burned Washington had been repulsed by American militia at Baltimore. The flag was still there. News of Baltimore's successful defense electrified the nation. After months of defeats and humiliations, Americans finally had a victory to celebrate. State militias that had been reluctant to serve suddenly found themselves overwhelmed with volunteers. The burning of Washington, rather than breaking American will, had forged it anew. Madison's government, operating from temporary quarters while Washington was rebuilt, found its position strengthened. The Federalist opposition that had been calling for peace at any price was now silent, unwilling to appear unpatriotic in the wave of nationalism following Baltimore. Madison himself, though his capital lay in ruins, had gained political credibility by staying with the government through the crisis and appointing strong leaders to replace the failures. The war's strategic picture was also shifting. In northern New York, a major British invasion force of 10,000 veterans had been moving south down the Champlain Valley, aiming to capture Plattsburgh and threaten New England. On September 11, 1814, just days before the Baltimore bombardment, American forces under General Alexander Macomb and Commodore Thomas MacDonough delivered a stunning defeat to the British at the Battle of Plattsburgh. Macdonough's naval squadron destroyed a British fleet on Lake Champlain in a desperate close-quarters battle. Without naval control of the lake, the British Army could not maintain its supply lines. Despite overwhelming numerical superiority, the British commander, General Sir George Prevost, ordered a retreat back to Canada. It was one of the most decisive American victories of the war. The combination of Baltimore and Plattsburgh transformed the military situation. British offensives along the entire eastern seaboard had been repulsed. American forces had proven they could defend their territory effectively, even against Wellington's veterans. The question now was not whether America would survive the war, but on what terms it would end. Even as Washington burned and British forces besieged Baltimore, American and British diplomats had been meeting in Ghent, in modern-day Belgium, attempting to negotiate a peace treaty. The talks had been dragging on for months, with both sides initially making impossible demands. The British had entered negotiations expecting victory. They demanded American territorial concessions, the creation of an independent Native American state in the Northwest Territory, and revisions to the Canadian-American border. The American delegates, John Quincy Adams, Henry Clay, and Albert Gallatin among them, refused these terms outright. News of British successes at Washington reached Ghent in October, briefly hardening British negotiating positions. But this was quickly followed by reports of the failures at Baltimore and Plattsburgh. Suddenly, the British realized that crushing America militarily would require a commitment of resources and time that the war-weary British public would not support. The Duke of Wellington himself, when consulted by the British government about taking command in America, advised against continuing the war. He told Prime Minister Lord Liverpool that Britain had no basis for demanding territorial concessions, since British forces had not secured any significant territorial gains. Wellington recommended making peace on the basis of status quo ante bellum, a return to pre-war boundaries with no territorial changes. The British government reluctantly accepted Wellington's advice. Britain was exhausted from 2 decades of war against France. The British economy needed peace. Continental European powers were watching to see how Britain would handle its post-war position. A costly, prolonged war against America served no British interests. On Christmas Eve 1814, American and British diplomats signed the Treaty of Ghent. The treaty essentially returned everything to the way it had been before the war. No territorial changes, no resolution of impressment or trade restrictions, though these issues had become moot with Napoleon's defeat. No independent Native American state. Both sides simply agreed to stop fighting and restore pre-war boundaries. When news of the treaty reached America in February 1815, it was greeted with relief and celebration. Americans chose to interpret the treaty as a victory. After all, they had fought the British Empire to a standstill and maintained their independence. The fact that none of the war's original causes had been addressed in the treaty was conveniently forgotten. The war had one final, dramatic chapter. Before news of the peace treaty reached America, British forces under General Sir Edward Pakenham launched an assault on New Orleans in January 1815. General Andrew Jackson, commanding a mixed force of regulars, militia, pirates, and free black soldiers, had fortified positions south of the city. On January 8, 1815, Pakenham ordered a frontal assault on Jackson's positions. It was a catastrophic mistake. American artillery and riflemen, firing from behind earthworks, slaughtered the advancing British columns. Pakenham himself was killed, along with 2 other British generals. British casualties exceeded 2,000, while American losses were fewer than 100. It was the most lopsided victory of the entire war. The Battle of New Orleans, fought after peace had been signed but before news reached the combatants, gave Americans a final triumph to celebrate. Jackson became a national hero, launching a political career that would carry him to the presidency. The battle cemented the American interpretation of the war as a victory, even though strategically it changed nothing. James Madison returned to a ruined capital in the spring of 1815. Washington resembled a ghost town. The president's house was a burned shell. The capitol's walls stood, but the interior was gutted. Government departments operated from temporary buildings. The city's population had fled and was only slowly returning. But there was also a sense of renewal, of opportunity. The burning of Washington had created a chance to rebuild better than before. The federal government committed resources to reconstruction. Architect Benjamin Henry Latrobe was commissioned to restore the Capitol. James Hoban, who had designed the original President's House, was hired to rebuild it. The restoration took years. The Capitol would not be fully restored until 1819. The President's House, rebuilt and painted white to cover the smoke stains on its sandstone walls, would gradually become known as the White House. The city itself slowly recovered, growing into the grand capital that Pierre L'Enfant had envisioned decades earlier. For Madison personally, the war's end brought relief and a measure of vindication. He had presided over the darkest moment in the young republic's history, the capture and burning of its capital. But he had also held the nation together through that crisis and guided it to a peace that preserved American independence and territorial integrity. The war transformed American nationalism. Before 1812, many Americans still identified primarily with their states rather than the nation. Regional differences seemed more important than national unity. The war, particularly the shared trauma of Washington's burning and the shared triumph of Baltimore and New Orleans, forged a stronger national identity. The conflict also devastated Native American hopes for independence. Tecumseh was dead. The Native Confederacy he had tried to build was shattered. The Treaty of Ghent promised to restore native lands seized during the war, but this provision was never enforced. American settlers continued pushing westward, and native peoples found themselves with no European ally to support their resistance. For enslaved Americans, the war brought both hope and disappointment. Thousands had escaped to British lines, finding freedom with the colonial Marines or in British territories. But slavery itself remained entrenched in the American South, and would continue for another 50 years until the Civil War finally ended it. The Federalist Party, which had opposed the war and even flirted with secession at the Hartford Convention in late 1814, was destroyed as a national political force. Their opposition to the war, particularly after the victories at Baltimore and New Orleans, made them appear unpatriotic. The Federalists would never win another presidential election, and by 1820, the party had essentially ceased to exist, ushering in the era of good feelings under Monroe's presidency. Dolley Madison never forgot the night she fled the president's house. In her later years, she would recount the story of saving Washington's portrait, often embellishing the details for dramatic effect. She became one of 19th century America's most beloved figures, a symbol of courage and grace under pressure. The portrait she saved remained one of the most iconic images of the first president. When it was finally rehung in the restored White House, it served as a reminder of both the crisis and the survival. The painting hangs there still, a tangible link to that August night in 1814. James Madison served out his second term and retired to Montpelier, his Virginia estate, in 1817. He lived another 19 years, becoming the last surviving signer of the Constitution, He watched as the nation he had helped create grew and prospered, expanding westward, developing economically, and establishing itself as a power that European nations had to respect. The War of 1812, and particularly the burning of Washington, passed into American mythology. The story was simplified and sanitized, transformed into a tale of heroic resistance and ultimate triumph. The humiliating defeats, the military incompetence, the panic and chaos, these aspects were downplayed or forgotten. What remained was the image of the Star-Spangled Banner flying over Fort McHenry, of Jackson's frontier riflemen mowing down British regulars at New Orleans, of a young nation standing up to the world's greatest empire. The British remembered it differently, if they remembered it at all. For Britain, the War of 1812 was a minor sideshow, a distraction from the main event of defeating Napoleon. The burning of Washington was barely noted in British histories, overshadowed by Waterloo and the Congress of Vienna. British veterans of the American campaign went on to serve throughout the empire, carrying with them stories of the strange, chaotic war in America. For historians, the War of 1812 remains controversial and complex. It was a war begun for reasons that had become irrelevant by the time it ended. It was fought to a draw, with neither side gaining significant advantage. The treaty that ended it resolved none of the issues that had caused it. By any objective measure, it was a pointless conflict that cost thousands of lives and accomplished nothing. Yet it mattered. It mattered because it tested whether the American Republic could survive a major war. It mattered because it forced Americans to define themselves as a nation rather than a collection of states. It mattered because it demonstrated that American democracy, for all its flaws and weaknesses, possessed a resilience that surprised both Americans and their enemies. The burning of Washington became a symbol of both America's vulnerability and its determination. The image of the president's house in flames represented the fragility of democratic institutions, the ease with which they could be destroyed by external force. But the fact that the government survived, that Madison returned to rebuild, that the nation emerged from the ashes stronger than before, that represented the deeper strength of democratic legitimacy. 200 years after the events of 1814, the scars of that war have long since healed. The White House stands restored and expanded, home to a succession of presidents who have faced their own crises. The Capitol, rebuilt and enlarged, dominates the Washington skyline. The city itself has grown from a muddy village to a world capital. But the memory persists. Every time Americans sing the Star-Spangled Banner, they invoke that September night when Fort McHenry held firm. Every time visitors tour the White House, they walk through rooms that once burned. The history is quite literally built into the stones of the Capitol. The War of 1812 established patterns that would recur throughout American history. It demonstrated both the strengths and weaknesses of American democracy in wartime. The civilian control of the military that Madison maintained, even as his generals failed him, became a precedent that is held through subsequent conflicts. The mobilization of citizen soldiers, the militia system that failed at Bladensburg but succeeded at Baltimore, evolved into the National Guard and reserve systems of today. The war also established America's complicated relationship with military power. Americans emerged from 1812 with a distrust of large standing armies and a preference for citizen soldiers, a preference that would persist through the 19th century. Yet they also recognized the need for professional military leadership and coastal fortifications, leading to the expansion of West Point and the construction of fort systems along the coast. Madison's handling of the crisis offers lessons for later generations. He maintained constitutional government even in the darkest hours. He never declared martial law, never suspended habeas corpus, never assumed dictatorial powers. When his capital burned, he did not flee to safety or sue for peace at any cost. He stayed, rallied his government, and found new leaders who could turn the tide. His mistakes were also instructive. His failure to adequately prepare for war, his retention of incompetent commanders too long, his inability to forge unity among his subordinates. These failures cost lives and nearly cost the nation its independence. Future presidents would study these mistakes and sometimes repeat them. The relationship between the United States and Britain was transformed by the war and its aftermath. The two nations would never again go to war with each other, despite tensions over various issues in the decades that followed: border disputes, trade conflicts, British support for the Confederacy during the Civil War. Both nations recognized that armed conflict served neither's interests. By the 20th century, they had become close allies, the special relationship that persists to this day. This rapprochement was built partly on the scorched stones of Washington. Both nations learned from 1814 that military conflict between them would be catastrophic for both sides. The British learned that America could not be easily subdued or reabsorbed into the empire. Americans learned that they shared language, legal traditions, and fundamental values with Britain that made long-term hostility irrational. For Native Americans, the war's legacy was tragic. The destruction of Tecumseh's Confederacy and the end of British support for Native resistance opened the floodgates for American westward expansion. In the decades following 1815, Native peoples would be systematically dispossessed of their lands, forced onto reservations, and subjected to policies of cultural genocide. The defeat of 1814 was not just military, but existential. The experience of enslaved Americans during the war likewise carried forward into the antebellum period. The thousands who escaped to British lines during the war demonstrated the universal human desire for freedom. Their example would inspire future generations who escaped via the Underground Railroad or who fought for the Union during the Civil War. The colonial Marines who fought at Bladensburg and Baltimore showed that black soldiers could fight as well as anyone, a lesson that would be relearned painfully in future American conflicts. Epilogue. The night the sky burned. On the night of August 24, 1814, residents of Washington and the surrounding countryside watched their capital burn. The sky glowed orange and red. Explosions echoed across the Potomac. The flames were visible for miles, a beacon of destruction that seemed to herald the end of the American experiment. Many who witnessed it believed they were watching the death of their republic. How could the nation survive such humiliation? How could a government whose capital lay in ruins maintain legitimacy? How could a people whose leaders had fled in panic maintain faith in their institutions? Yet survive it did. The flames that consumed the president's house and the Capitol did not consume the idea of America. The British could burn buildings, but they could not burn the Constitution that Madison carried with him as he fled. They could destroy the physical symbols of American sovereignty, but they could not destroy the sovereignty itself. In that paradox lies the deeper meaning of the burning of Washington. Democratic governments do not reside in buildings or symbols. They exist in the consent of the governed, in the legitimacy granted by the people, in the shared commitment to constitutional principles. Buildings can be rebuilt, documents can be rewritten, but if the underlying commitment to democratic governance persists, the government persists. Madison understood this instinctively. He never considered surrender or dissolution. The government would continue, even if it had to operate from tents. Congress would meet, even if they had to gather in temporary buildings. The presidency would function, even if the president's house was a ruin. The republic would endure. And it did. Within weeks of the burning, government operations had resumed. Within months, military victories at Baltimore and Plattsburgh demonstrated American resilience. Within a year, the war had ended and Reconstruction had begun. Within a decade, Washington had been rebuilt, more permanent and grander than before. The fire that nearly destroyed American government ultimately strengthened it. The crisis forced Americans to confront fundamental questions about their national identity and commitment. The answers they found in the resolve to defend Baltimore, in the refusal to surrender, in the determination to rebuild, forged a stronger national consciousness. James Madison, the slight scholarly man who seemed so ill-suited for wartime leadership, proved adequate to the moment. He did not provide inspiring military leadership or brilliant strategic vision, but he provided something more important: steady, principled commitment to constitutional governance even in the darkest hours. When many would have panicked or assumed dictatorial powers, Madison held firm to the principles he had spent his life defending. Dolley Madison, in her own way, was equally important. Her courage in staying at the president's house until the last moment, her foresight in saving crucial documents and symbols, her dignity in the face of displacement, all of these qualities provided a human face to the crisis. While James Madison represented constitutional continuity, Dolley represented American resilience and grace under pressure. The soldiers who died at Bladensburg, the militiamen who held at Baltimore, the sailors who defended Fort McHenry, they all played their parts in the survival of the Republic. Many of them were ordinary citizens, farmers and tradesmen and clerks, who took up arms when their country called. Their performance was sometimes heroic, sometimes inadequate, but always human. The night the White House burned, America faced its greatest crisis since the Revolutionary War. A generation that had grown up hearing stories of the Founding Fathers' heroism now faced their own test. They did not always meet it perfectly. They made mistakes, suffered defeats, and experienced moments of panic and failure. But they endured, they learned, they adapted, and ultimately they prevailed. 2 centuries later, the scorch marks have long since faded from the White House walls. The Capitol has been rebuilt and expanded many times over. Washington, D.C. has transformed from a vulnerable village into a world capital. But the lessons of 1814 remain relevant. Democratic institutions are simultaneously fragile and resilient. They can be physically destroyed, but spiritually unbreakable. They depend not on buildings or symbols, but on the commitment of citizens to maintain them. The fire that consumed Washington on that hot August night was both an ending and a beginning. It ended American illusions about the ease of maintaining independence. It began a new understanding of American identity, forged not in the triumph of revolution, but in the crucible of survival. The republic that emerged from those flames was different from what had existed before, more unified, more nationalist, more conscious of both its vulnerabilities and its strengths. James Madison would spend his retirement years reflecting on the events of 1814. He never wrote extensively about the burning of Washington, perhaps finding the memory too painful. But in his correspondence and conversations, he returned again and again to themes of resilience, constitutional fidelity, and the importance of citizen engagement in Republican government. He had lived through the founding of the Republic, had helped draft its fundamental charter, had served in its government for decades, and had ultimately presided over its greatest crisis. He had seen the literal flames consuming the symbols of American sovereignty and had witnessed the nation's rebirth from those ashes. If any man understood the fragility and strength of democratic government, it was Madison. On June 28, 1836, James Madison died at Montpelier, the last of the Founding Fathers to pass. Dolley survived him by 13 years, dying in 1849 at age 81. Both were mourned as heroes of the Republic, their ordeal in 1814 remembered as a testament to American endurance. The portrait of George Washington that Dolley saved still hangs in the White House. Visitors pause before it, often unaware of its dramatic history. But the painting serves as a silent witness to that night of flames and flight, a reminder that the symbols of democracy can be preserved even when democracy itself is under attack. The White House itself stands as a monument to resilience. Its walls, reconstructed after the fire, have sheltered presidents through wars, depressions, scandals, and triumphs. It has been the stage for moments of greatness and shame, wisdom and folly. But it has endured, much like the republic it represents. The burning of Washington was meant to be a final, humiliating blow to American pretensions. Instead, it became a defining moment of American identity. The nation that rose from those ashes was more confident, more unified, and more certain of its future than the one that had stumbled into war in 1812. In the end, the British burned buildings, but they forged a nation. The flames that consumed the White House and the Capitol illuminated, paradoxically, the path forward for American democracy. In the light of that conflagration, Americans saw clearly what mattered, not the buildings that housed government, but the principles that animated it, not the symbols of sovereignty, but sovereignty itself, not the physical manifestations of the republic, but the republic of the mind and heart. That was James Madison's war for America, not a war for territory or trade or maritime rights, but a war for the survival of democratic principles. He fought it not with brilliant military strategy or inspiring battlefield leadership, but with stubborn constitutionalism, with refusal to abandon principles even in the darkest hours, with faith that the Republic could survive any crisis if its leaders remained true to its founding ideals. The night the White House burned, that faith was tested as never before. And in the ruins of the morning, in the smoke-stained walls and the ashes of government, that faith persisted. America would rebuild, America would endure, and the fire that was meant to destroy the Republic had only tempered it, like steel in a forge, making it stronger for the trials ahead. This is the story of 1814, of flames and fear, of defeat and determination, of a republic that stood at the edge of destruction and stepped back. It is a story of human frailty and human strength, of mistakes and redemption, of the fragility of democratic institutions and their ultimate resilience. It is, finally, a story that every generation of Americans must understand. For the challenges that faced Madison's generation, maintaining democratic principles under pressure, responding to threats without abandoning values, finding unity in diversity, preserving institutions while allowing them to evolve, these challenges are eternal. Each generation must face them anew, must find its own answers, must prove itself worthy of the republic it inherits. The flames that consumed Washington in 1814 have long since cooled, but the light they shed on the nature of democratic governance burns still, illuminating the path for those who come after, reminding us that republics are not maintained by buildings or monuments, but by the eternal vigilance and commitment of free citizens.